Right, it is exactly 14:30, so I am going to get started, considering we are the last set of the show. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Really do appreciate you being here. I'm really excited about this. I must explain, my name is not Andy. My name is Lucy Pryor. Bauer have kindly asked me to step in for Andy, who has unfortunately had to have a change of plans. So my name is Lucy Pryor. I'm Business Development Lead at Octavius Infrastructure, but also a friend of Bauer Media, so I get to do cool things like this and speak to cool, amazing, intelligent people. So with no further ado, I would like you each, please, to introduce yourselves. So in my best Scylla voice, what's your name and where do you come from? And if you give me your immediate reflections on, on the topic of today, NPR and Midlands Rail Hub, and are they answering the problems?
I'm Henri Murison, and I'm from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. And we've, for the last 10 years, been trying to make the case for better rail connectivity in the north of England, not as an end in itself, as I'm sure we'll get into discussing, but in order to close some of the economic divides in our country. And it just happens that better rail connections are one of the ways you can stimulate and grow economies. So I am not a rail professional. I am like literally here on false pretenses slightly, and it's lovely to be in your worlds because we have been trying to make the argument for Northern Powerhouse Rail and for HS2 in the context of what they would do, particularly for the economy of the northern cities. The government has now accepted that argument and has allocated £45 billion over the next few decades to build new and improved links between within the northwest, within Yorkshire, and across the Pennines, and in the longer term has recommitted to a new line between the North and the Midlands. So it's really lovely to be with friends, not just from the North, but from the Midlands, because I think my answer to your really good question would be that unless you also better connect the North, and in particular Birmingham, which opens up connections to the rest of the Midlands, you do leave a really big gap in the country's wider connectivity and economic opportunity. And the reason why Andy Street and Andy Burnham asked a consortium of businesses to come up with some ideas for how you could solve that problem was that if you want the whole country to thrive over the coming decades, the idea that you would only build HS2 from London to Birmingham is absolutely nuts. And so you've got to find a way to make use of that capacity, and that broadly means building something that looks a bit like Phase 2A of HS2, probably not call it HS2, but I think we frame it as an extension to Northern Powerhouse Rail, which is how the Chancellor has sort of presented it, which I don't think anyone in Birmingham really cares about. I think the idea of being able to get to the north of England always seemed very popular to Andy Street. I think his replacement now as mayor following the elections last year, Richard Parker, takes a similar view. And I think that for the Midlands, the opportunity of being part of what is a very much kind of growing collection of cities that are more connected together to each other is a positive. And so this isn't an argument just about what's good for the north of England. And the whole point of the north of England's prosperity being important to government is because it's a big chunk of the country. If you can raise the prosperity of the north of England, raise its productivity, you can address the fact that we currently run our country based on the tax revenues of people in London and the South East. And with productivity over the last 20 years in London having fallen, not just not risen, but actually fallen, that is not a sustainable position. So whether it's from a rail and connectivity perspective or from an economic perspective, this is not an insular debate. And that's why it's so good to talk to the people in the room, right, who are going to work on some of these projects. And you can make a good case that there's a little bit of Northern Powerhouse Rail's kind of outcomes as part of TransPennine Route Upgrade, which obviously is the existing ongoing upgrade across the north of England, and how we take those people who've been working on that project and give them a clear line of sight to future opportunities, not just for electrification, but in the end for building new lines, including a new tunnel between Piccadilly and the airport. If we don't have that clarity of ambition and don't send the right demand signals, which I'm sure we can talk about in a bit more detail, then we won't have the people and the capacity to build that infrastructure at a price the government and the private investors and the local government and institutions that are going to help pay for this will be able to afford.
Thank you. Over to yourself, Andrew.
Yeah. Afternoon, everyone. Andy Clark. I'm Rail Programme Lead at Midlands Connect. Very excited to be here this afternoon to talk to you about Midlands Rail Hub. So this is our flagship rail scheme for the Midlands. Just, I guess, a bit of background. In many ways, it's actually very similar to what Henri has said. But I think in the Midlands context, there are really two key issues. There's a very acute transport issue in the Midlands, in that Birmingham is effectively full. So it's very, very difficult to add additional rail services through the West Midlands. The other thing that's absolutely true is a lot of the socio-economic issues that Henri's described are also true in the Midlands. So, for example, we've got really ambitious levels of housing for the region. The government is very keen on economic growth. Also, the government is very keen on access to opportunity. So there is a rail service, but actually it doesn't necessarily go where people need it to, at the right frequency, the right price, etc., etc. So I tend to think of it in two halves. There's a really acute transport issue, but there's also a really acute socio-economic set of challenges. So anyway, the solution to this, from our perspective, is absolutely Midlands Rail Hub. So this is relatively modest in rail terms. You get change from 2 billion, so it's not cheap, but actually in rail terms, it's relatively modest. This is to build new infrastructure, primarily in the Birmingham area, that enables more trains to run into the West Midlands. So some of you might be familiar with the Bordersley cords. We build those cords, and that enables trains into Birmingham Moor Street from the south and from the East Midlands. And actually, the numbers are really impressive. So 300 additional trains per day, 20 million seats per year. To be honest, the business case writes itself.
Thank you. And finally, Lisa.
Good afternoon, I'm Lisa Bowden, I'm Director for Balfour Beatty Rail. From our perspective, really, as most people in the room, lots of ambition, lots of aspiration, particularly around major transport schemes and rail schemes, but not necessarily a lot of activity. And I think, like many, as a major infrastructure delivery organisation, we're waiting for action, because actions speak louder than words. And I think from where we sit at the moment, we're here, shovel ready, and have been for the last decade, ready, like many, to start putting spades in the ground. And I think for us, seeing that commitment translated into reality is really important. And it's been really nice to see, maybe a little bit bittersweet for us in terms of Midlands Rail Hub, but nonetheless, actually really pleased to see that take a major step forward, because it does allow contractors and the supply chain to really start to commit investment. You know, we're at Rail Live today, and we've got people here with stands talking about new innovations and AI and plant and materials. And the rail sector is probably at a pivotal moment as we stand in the next year or two, where organisations are having to make decisions around ability to retain plant and people and invest in apprenticeships and training. And while we have schemes like NPR still in the discussion stage, that isn't really helpful to us. And we want to see that move forward. So for us as an organisation, we absolutely back the ambition, but really want to be much further now down the line in the conversation to how do we shift that ambition to reality.
We want to have something to do, essentially, don't we?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Before we go any further, I'd like a show of hands, because I'd like to better understand our audience. So please, raise your hands if you live south of Birmingham. Okay, thank you. Raise your hands if you live in the Midlands. So, thank you. And do we have any northerners in the room? Thank you. So we're getting thinner as we go further north. So actually, hopefully there's going to be a lot of good information sharing here as well, because I think one of the most important things of major infrastructure is helping us understand how it benefits us all. Mm-hmm. None of this has to be parochial or should be parochial. The question set to us are the timetables. Are they achievable? And are they bold enough to solve the problems? We've touched on them already. I want to flip that in complete reverse. Can we agree on what the problems are first, please?
So I mean, the economic disparity between the north of England and the kind of greater southeast is sort of it's not been the case forever, but basically for the last 100 years it's been pretty entrenched. And you've started to see some evidence where we have invested in transport, actually initially, particularly because this is where the investment has been in local public transport. So we've done work on Manchester, on Greater Manchester, which now has the fastest productivity growth of anywhere in the country, of all the city regions. And what's interesting is, if you look at the places in Greater Manchester that have done well, you would obviously think the city centre's done very well, and it has, but so has the rest of the conurbation. And in fact, there's this very exciting economic geography area that's called the Northwest Quadrant of Greater Manchester, which was the bit that doesn't have tram, and it was the slowest to start to benefit from that, whereas the other side, the Northeast Quadrant, so for the old money, Bury, Oldham, Rochdale, which has 2 tram lines, and Bury was one of the first ones, you have significantly better economic outcomes already. And the point of that is that people live above a shopping centre in the centre of Bury. When they built the Rock, people thought it was mad there were flats above it. Now they are genuinely hard to get hold of and rent for comparable amounts of money to housing in and around the city centre in Manchester, because people want to live in Bury town centre because they can jump on the tram and get to work. And for the businesses who've invested in Manchester, the Krakens of this world owned by Octopus Energy, all the big blue chip digital businesses, Amazon have a huge presence in Manchester, for example. Their ability to attract talent into their business is absolutely critical for them deciding to be there. So effective transport links are essential, and there is a reason why, for example, the Bradfords of this world that Lisa and I have worked on over the years in particular, and all the work Lisa and her colleagues in our last place of work did, has now won that argument, and we're going to build a new railway station in Bradford as part of phase 1 of Northern Powerhouse Rail. Bradford has some of the worst health outcomes in the country, and it costs the government more to serve the NHS there, a lot more than it does in nearby York. So this isn't just a north-south thing. These concentrations of disadvantage cost money wherever they are in the country. We just happen to have more of them, and they tend to be bigger in the north of England. We spend more on working age benefits in those places. And so the government, and those of you in the room who are taxpayers, which as this is an event largely geared at people who have to be at work in an industry, I'm guessing is pretty much all of us, like whether you live in the north or not, you are paying for the costs of that economic failure. And so fundamentally, this is not about railways. I mean, I was very clear in saying why I'm a sort of not really a sort of fish out of water, why I probably really shouldn't be here. It's that I am not making a railway argument for this project, because that is not why government is funding it. Government has decided they want to have a northern growth corridor across the Pennines, broadly equivalent to the previous Conservative government's Northern Powerhouse ambition. And in order to deliver that ambition, you have to invest in a number of things, in energy and innovation, but you also have to invest in railways and other forms of transport. And fundamentally, there is no way to raise productivity in the north of England to its potential without significant rail investment. So we need the rail industry to deliver that investment at a price the public sector and private investors can afford, because people in those communities like Bradford's are crying out for better connectivity to get to jobs, for example, in places like Manchester. Manchester is a very short distance from Bradford. It takes over an hour usually by rail to get there, and it's not a particularly reliable connection. So if you're looking at a very large city, which is one of the most diverse in the country, with very high levels of disadvantage, the youngest city in the country, all those young people, what do we want them to do? Do we want them to sit on benefits, or do we want them to get good quality jobs? And the way to get good employers to come to Bradford, and the way to get those people to jobs in other places, is through better rail links.
Thank you. What problems do you think we are challenging?
I mean, I think Henri has articulated the Northern Challenge extremely well there. But I think I'm probably going to go a bit bolder in terms of connecting people and place. You know, when we left Brexit and we have to plough our own furrow, really, as a country, you know, when you look at places like Bradford and the argument that was a number of years ago, you know, we have the youngest population in the country in Bradford. You know, significant number of languages spoken. And we talk about interconnectivity or getting people to Manchester, but actually one of the jewels in the crown that NPR would have brought was connecting Bradford with Manchester Airport, because very quickly you go from having an intraconnectivity to a national connectivity to an international and global connectivity. And when you look at a lot of our counterparts in Europe, you know, we are very few that don't have a high-speed or rail connection. And investment in transport is key, not only if we compete on a national stage, but on an international stage. You know, it is significant, and we forget that actually in terms of where we are. And I think Manchester always has had a very bold ambition. and brand Manchester has that bold ambition, and lots of people buy into that. But the challenge is that we have to have decentralisation of decision making, because even now that funding's been announced, some of those powers are still holding that in central government and in Whitehall, and actually that money needs to flow faster so that decision making can be made more locally, and people can spend that locally, and we'll see schemes come to the fore. But actually those schemes will not only bring national benefit, but international benefit. And I think I was chatting before about Ireland. We are at a risk of competing now with international schemes, all the high-speed rail schemes that are going to come in Europe, in Ireland, and very quickly we will be competing in the UK. We will have drip-fed money and investment into start delivery mode. However, we will then compete for those resources and people to deliver it as the next decade follows.
Thank you. And Andy?
You mentioned Manchester to Bradford. I think we've got a good case study right on our doorstep here, which is Birmingham to Nottingham. So our two biggest cities in the Midlands are actually very poorly connected at the moment. So if you turned up at New Street this afternoon and you caught a train to Nottingham, it would take you about 75 minutes. You can actually drive it a lot quicker than 75 minutes. And this is really borne out in some of the stats. So the mode share for rail, so proportion of people using rail, is below 20%. So to put it another way, 4 out of 5 people think actually it's easier to drive between our two biggest cities in the Midlands. So we think there's an awful lot you can do. Of course, that's very much looking at the sort of transport specifics of the corridor. I think one thing that surprised me when I was looking at the business case for better links between Birmingham and Nottingham is actually what we call the wider economic benefits. So it's not just me sitting here making it up. This is a real thing that can be quantified. And a lot of the wider economic benefit for us is what we call agglomeration. And this is about enabling businesses to trade much more effectively with each other. So what we see at the moment is that, the cities aren't doing too badly. Granted, productivity could be better, but actually they're not really trading as a region. If we had fast, frequent rail service between our cities, actually the level of economic interaction would be considerably higher, and that's very, very obvious when you look under the bonnet of the business case. I think another thing I'd mention in this space is that one of the metrics we use in the Midlands are social mobility cold spots. Again, it sounds like something from a PhD, but actually this is really relevant to Midlands Rail Hub. So these are the 20% least well-connected places in England, and actually about half of those are in the Midlands. So these are places where if we improve the transport offer, we can make a meaningful impact on people's lives. So we could get them to college, to other education, into better paid jobs, etc., etc. So again, I like to talk rail because I'm a rail planner, but actually it's really helpful to step outside of the rail space and think much more broadly, as Henri alluded to.
Well, it's me that talks about agglomeration. People start leaving, so it's good someone else did that first.
No one left.
If I can add to that, you talked about modal shift there and mode choice. I'm very, very deeply embedded at the minute into that whole debate around devolution, giving people the choice of mode, and helping people out of the private car, giving them the best choice to them. And we've talked a lot about the passenger, but the customer, the transport customer, also includes freight, for example. So if we can get modal shift of people and modal shift of commodities, does that not reap even larger economic benefits for our regions interconnected, that movement of goods around the country, but it's also cleansing our air, increasing our lifespans? I'm going to give a really, really hard reiteration of something you just said, Henri. So I live in Sheffield. As the crow flies, the difference in life expectancy between Darnall in the east end of Sheffield and Fulwood Ranmore in the western suburbs is something like 8 years. 2 or 3 miles as the crow flies, depending on where you're born, you're going to die 8 years earlier. And that's through all sorts of things. But if we can address these socioeconomic matters that can positively change lives up, open job access and skills access up as well, it could be phenomenal. Something else that I wanted to draw out of the conversation, you've each used the word corridor. Now, beforehand, we talked before this session a little about East West Rail. I remember distinctly various different representatives of East West Rail at the point that the shift was made from talking about it as a transport project to a socio-economic project. There was just a lift in how that was perceived. So how do we change that narrative for everything that we want to build and realise?
I think from a Midlands perspective, we've spoken to an awful lot of MPs over the last couple of years, very deliberately. So, as you might imagine, we're trying our absolute hardest to get funding for the entirety of the scheme. And actually talking to the MPs has been really useful. So, I guess in my comfort zone, I'm talking to them about journey times, types of train, etc., etc. But actually, some of the things that really get the interest of the MPs are things like the supply chain impacts. So we commissioned a piece of work with the National Skills Academy for Rail, and actually they really brought the thing to life for us. So they said, yeah, it's a 2 billion project. What does that mean in terms of supply chain? And actually what they were able to do is to say, yeah, this would translate into this many apprentices in the Midlands, at which point the MPs think, great, local jobs. So for me, some of the additional metrics have really helped with our case making for MPs.
Thank you. Anything to add to that, Henri?
Yeah, no, and I think it's worth pointing out, and I mean, I should have dwelled more on freight and heard some of the freight conversation earlier this afternoon. I'm sure other people were in as well. If you look at the Port of Hull and the Port of Immingham go across to Liverpool at the moment, it's really challenging to get freight across that corridor. And there is a genuine market for moving more across the Pennines. So I briefly referenced Trans-Pennine Route Upgrade earlier. That is a significant project in its own right. It's £11 billion. It's already happening. And that will deliver significant freight benefits. I think it's worth saying, though, that clearly, that just like HS2, if you build new lines, some of the biggest winners are freight. And that was entirely lost in the HS2 debate. But all that freight that comes from Scotland down the West Coast Main Line is our solution for the capacity issues on the West Coast Main Line over the next 30 years if we don't build a new railway, particularly between Handsacre and Crewe, which is the really challenging pinch point, to just take freight off the roads. And we have had the challenge, people in the previous rail ministers, right? As much as I love Andrew Adonis, and I agree with Andrew about many, many things, Andrew Adonis, when he chaired the National Infrastructure Commission, as it was, and what is now NISTA, was pretty anti-freight on the railway. He was like, oh, this is for passengers, this is about agglomeration economics, and everything else can go to the wind. And I think we have got a government that has made very clear that they want the railways to deliver numerous outcomes, and one of those is to move freight around the country more effectively. And in the north of England, that's really important. We've got a number of my members and funders, the people who pay my wages, are businesses. I work for the private sector. They rely on those freight connections, and they're just not good enough at the moment. And so it isn't just businesses that would benefit from access to talent, the Amazons of this world and their sort of shiny office in the centre of Manchester for their Amazon Web Services business. It's not just people like Bruntwood who build office space in Manchester or Leeds, Liverpool or Birmingham that want this stuff. It's also large businesses that have a big freight requirement. And I think, as we know, those freight voices are often not heard in these debates. And I think with lots of concern about how we meet the government's freight target, there is a genuine issue that some of the reason why we don't have the freight movements that we would want is because the paths just don't exist. There is not enough rail capacity east to west across the north of England. Even Trans-Pennine Route Upgrade only gets you so far. You get extra paths, but there's probably not enough. And the only solution is what is a sort of full-blooded, third phase of NPR, which would mean a new line all the way from Marsden to Manchester Piccadilly. That is a very expensive intervention. And government are not as entirely wild about doing it, which is why it's in phase 3, because the Treasury would much rather we made do with TRU. And if all you use that railway was for passengers, maybe that would be true. But the reality is, we as a country also want to use the railway for freight. And if you want to do that, you have to accept the fact that having freight stopping services and higher speed services, and that would include the West Coast Main Line, all using the same infrastructure, is not really sustainable long term. Something's going to give. And either you build new lines for your intercity services, whether it's high speed or not, I actually don't really care. The point is about having those segregated lines available so that you can maximise the capacity, not just for those sort of agglomeration building, sort of city-to-city services, but so that you can also still do all the other things the railway does. And we shouldn't have to choose between that local connectivity. And I spend a lot of my time talking to local rail user groups across the Pennines who are paranoid that I'm going to take away their local train service so I can sort of fulfil my northern economic ambitions. And my point is I don't want to do that. Don't think local communities should be cut off the rail network. The only way to do that, though, is to invest more money. You can't protect that local connectivity and have those wider economic benefits unless you build new capacity. Upgrades will only ever get you so far.
I think a huge part of that as well is how we, whether from the policy angle or the supply chain, the delivery, the build angle, we have got to get better at communicating with the public. Because quite often these things are done to them. Whether you're talking about a tiny little rural train station that people can't get in and out of and they can't understand why, to why all of a sudden are these great big hoofing systems being built in my backyard. So I believe that the rail industry and the wider construction and national infrastructure voices have a responsibility to be more eloquent in face of the Republic. Coming back to the question that was set, we've talked to the problem. We've talked about what problems we could be solving with better connectivity across the macro and micro scale, freight and passenger. Looking specifically at NPR and Midlands Rail Hub and the timescales that are on the table right now, are we going to achieve these timescales?
We will deliver phases 1, 2 and 3 of NPR. I think the problem we've got is that sort of what is notionally phase 4, which is what will end up probably being Handsacre to Crewe and something that gets you from Manchester Airport to Crewe, we don't quite know what that will look like yet, can't be in the 2040s because the West Coast Main Line is full pretty much now and it's only going to get worse. So our issue is actually not that the public sector ambition for what's going to be delivered within the north of England is absolutely fine and I think is deliverable. I think the reality is that there were lots of people in the northwest that didn't like the idea that their new shiny rail lines would come after upgrades in Yorkshire. But that isn't a political choice by the government, just reflects the reality that we've spent the last few years since we cancelled, or since the government cancelled HS2 to Manchester, not consenting a new tunnel that would enable you to get from Manchester to Liverpool, and that's now 3-4 years further away than it was when that decision was first made. So you can't make that unhappen. That has now happened, and it's not easy to resolve that. So we have messed around. I would argue central government has messed around a little bit, not under the current administration, but under the last one. But if we can stick now to what's been agreed, I think we can deliver what's been required of us. And I think that economically, we can't afford not to.
Yeah. Andy?
Just checking if my boss is in the room. She's not. So I'll give the honest answer. I think for Midlands Rail Hub, we've had a really important year. So we've appointed a public-private sector rail alliance. I can see at least a handful of people in the room from that alliance. And this is very much to get us into delivery mode. So people like me have spent long enough writing lots of business cases for the scheme. It's absolutely great that we're now into boots in the ground. So the alliance is there. Obviously, it's incentivised to get on and build the thing as quickly as possible. We'd like the scheme to be in place by the early 2030s. I know that sounds a bit vague. We are working behind the scenes to firm that up. We're also seeking funding for some of the other bits of the scheme that are really, really important, but haven't quite got over the line yet in terms of funding. So we'd like the whole thing in place, certainly by the mid-2030s, and we think that's absolutely doable. I agree with what Henri has said on the much broader HS2 link. Obviously, we've had the reset announcement in recent weeks. We were, I guess, as disappointed as everyone else that we thought we were getting something in the early 2030s. It looks like it's potentially a decade later. I guess this isn't the kind of the corporate Midlands Connect view. My own view, perhaps, is that delay might give us a bit longer to sort out some of the constraints further north. Obviously, when HS2 was cancelled, we were left with phase 1, which is great. It's a high-speed railway, gets you kind of halfway through the Midlands, doesn't quite get you far enough. So we're working behind the scenes with the industry to look at what we might do slightly further north to resolve some of those bottlenecks. So for me, perhaps the silver lining of the delay is that we can get a bit further forward with some of those constraints further north.
Thank you. And Lisa, I want to come to you now as, we'll take your company badge off, but as an infrastructure expert and working across all the different sectors that you're experienced in and the different companies you're experienced with, how can that top end of the supply chain help achieve the ambitions that Henri and Andy are setting out?
I mean, for me, sort of amalgamating some of the things Henri and Andy's just talked about then, when we look at where we are now, there still needs to be greater clarity on what's going to be delivered and when, because that's only how we will start to look at what the overall vision is and how we can support that. Because at the moment, the advice and guidance we can give and where we can come to the table as major infrastructure delivery contractors is difficult because the scope's changing, the route's still not quite clear. You know, schemes, providing commitment to schemes isn't necessarily there. So that means we have to take a back seat still at the moment. I was in NPR before it was cancelled for a year, and we was looking at, money was spent to look at the route across the north. All that good work had to be disbanded, and at the time there was lots of people in there and lots of contracting organisations like Balfour Beatty supporting and providing early contractor advice and input and support. And there's only so much we can do that as big organisations without really having the certainty that the ambition is moving forward to intent. I think some of the things that you've just spoke about there, Andy, and about being on that journey now, and about HS2, moving beyond 2030, sometimes I think what we actually need is some, when we're in programme delivery mode and we're delivering a project, we have really stringent KPIs that we're measured against. What we don't have sometimes is really stringent KPIs during the early phases that monitors and measures critical milestones. A new report gets commissioned and we just move the boundary forward, and there's no implications of doing so.
It's wishy-washy, isn't it?
It's wishy-washy. And I think I'll go back to the old phrase, what gets measured gets managed. And I think there's elements of in early phases that we have to put stringent KPIs that are maybe publicly reported.
Yeah.
And the consequences of that and the financial impacts of moving goalposts. And I'd like to see some more critical milestones around measurement about what we talk about, because that will actually give more confidence to delivery organisations to get involved, because we know what we're working towards.
I think in some ways the politics can actually help us at times, and we've had this very recently on Midlands Rail Hub, where we've got a lot of political support, particularly from the Labour Party in South Birmingham, and the conversation with them isn't what's going to happen by the mid-2030s, it's what can you deliver in this Parliament. So actually there's some real political pressure to try and crack on with this so that we can demonstrate progress on the ground, which I think as an industry is probably really helpful.
Yeah, and having that timeline, and even if it is within parliamentary time periods, at least we know where we are and we know what we're working to, and it does take that blurred edges away.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a huge list of questions in my head, but I really do want some audience participation. So do we have any questions, please, from the floor? Sir? If you could say your name and where you're from, and if your question's for everyone or one specific person.
Mark Hambley, I'm actually now retired. Question, I think, mainly for Andy, but picking up also on Lisa's point about that early measurement. Are there more things we can do now? You mentioned, Andy, Birmingham to Nottingham. Probably the service group that's got the highest cancellation rate at the moment as well. So can sort of people like Midlands Connect be actually getting the TOCs to train more crew and really practical things like that, so that this culture of using rail and all the societal benefits come from it, we don't have to wait till these big schemes are finished, but we can start seeing a bit more of it now?
That's a really good question. I guess just to provide some reassurance that cross-country are very much in the tent for Midlands Rail Hub, so they're really big supporters. And I think for me, the thing that Midlands Rail Hub buys you between the West and the East Midlands is the segregation of services that Henri alluded to. So at the moment, you could say cross-country is all things to all people. So they've got huge commuter flows to Tamworth, longer distance people trying to get to Nottingham and beyond, and only so many services. What you get in the future, when Midlands Rail Hub is on the ground, is a set of discrete, fast intercity services, but also some effective services that serve those local markets. We've actually got, I mean, it's true of Birmingham to Nottingham. It's exactly the same for Birmingham to Leicester. So obviously they're carrying people as far afield as Cambridge and Stansted. They're also carrying a lot of commuters to Nuneaton. It's really difficult for them to manage that. Obviously in terms of cancellations, a bit more difficult for me to answer, but I think fundamentally the vision is that we provide a much more segregated service. So people wanting to get quickly to Leicester, get on one train, people needing to get to Waterorton, Coleshill Parkway, some of the intermediate markets are probably on a different train.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you, Mark Sullivan. Transport Users Consultative Committee in the past. I think we just need to remember that Mr. Murison is representing a private sector group, whereas Mr. Clark is for the, he's called a subnational transport body still, which of course in the north is a thing called Transport for the North, where I'm not here today. I just would like to note that many people, it's the local rail service which is important, and this is where I wonder if some of this is getting a bit too stuck on longer distances. I mean, yesterday there was reference to Manchester Regional Rail and the need for, well, not Mr. Burnham's underground mainline station, but an underground cross-city railway, otherwise known as PICMIC or possibly PIC-SAL. And I think really that's what is still obviously going to end up being done in Manchester. And it's sort of really have to be faced down, that one. And Bradford, I am a bit puzzled. If we're still talking about a station on the southeast and outside the city, Bradford is, I think you are, but I'm not sure, because the real thing at Bradford is an obvious north-south Verbindungsbahns, S-Bahn right through the city, which would work very well in Bradford. But everybody trying...
You'd have to demolish the...
Well, whatever they've done in bad planning in Bradford, it's getting stuck.
I mean, as a Bradfordian, I'll start on that one.
No, look, can I just... I don't, that's all I've got to say.
I mean, factually, that railway was never connected because the Victorians could never get their act together to do it. So I think that is unfortunately a bit of historical planning that I don't even think the current or recent governments could take the fault for.
Well, you're stuck with an inefficient railway until it's done. And the same point about Manchester. But I think on Midlands, I've had dealings with the Midlands Railways in the past. Incidentally, in the days of British Rail, there were never cancellations. There were lots of late running. But the cancellations is a thing that's just happening nowadays, and it's really unfortunate. But I do think on Midlands Connect, you know, the biggest urban corridor, Mr. Clark, that you haven't looked at is Telford, Wolverhampton, Walsall, Aldridge, Lichfield, Burton, and then into Nottingham. That route, which means not having to go via New Street, would actually be very heavily used, but it's never studied, and you do know that people don't like changing at New Street. So I leave that one with you. Also, I do regret that there was no effort by Midlands Hub to get the second carriageway of the Newark Relief Road, have a railway width to it, to add tracks to go over the East Coast Main Line. I thought that was going to be done, but as far as I know, it's not going to be done, which is very strange. I thought that was what Midlands Hub was there for, to get road and rail coordinated, but it hasn't happened at Newark.
Yeah, Nottingham to Lincoln for us is a really important corridor. As you say, there's a highway improvement that goes over the top of the East Coast Main Line. I think in an ideal world, we'd have taken the opportunity to build an equivalent rail route across the East Coast Main Line. It's not something we're still very interested. I think for us, probably challenge number one at the moment is affordability. So there's a big list of stuff we'd really like to do, but unfortunately we've got to really prioritise, and for us we're down to a handful of biggies in the Midlands. So Midlands Rail Hub, absolutely, Coventry, Leicester, Nottingham, Wolverhampton, Shrewsbury, Nottingham to Lincoln. We've got 6 or 7 things that we think get us quite a long way in the short to medium term. That's not to say what you've described there isn't a good thing to do in the long term.
Can I just pick up on a couple of points there, or an underlying theme, really, from what you were talking about? I suppose what we have is a collection of projects across the country, as opposed to a integrated network. And I think at the moment what we forget often is that passengers remember the journey, not the project. And if we look at the country as a national entity, we're probably not considering what a national logistics strategy looks like in terms of movement of people and produce in some respects. But we focus solely on individual projects and what that means actually, as opposed to creating a unified transport network. And I think that's a barrier that at the moment we're nowhere near thinking about. And that sprung to mind from your questions there and brought me to a conversation that I was having with somebody from the defence sector recently, where we were talking about in times of national emergency, how would we use our rail network to move people and plant and materials around the country very effectively. And actually, we don't talk about that when we're talking about passengers and journeys. And ultimately, that's all people want to do. You want your goods and services brought to you in an efficient and cost-effective manner. And you want to move around as an individual in a cost-effective and easy manner. And I am often the subject of cancelled trains in London as I connect a couple of times a week up and down to Crewe. So I'm a passenger who feels that pain. And only last week we couldn't get to a Network Rail meeting, and we were apologising because we couldn't get there because we were stuck on the train. And then I actually put myself in the eyes of being the passenger, and I thought, well, I'm actually apologising for being a passenger on an unreliable network today. And I put myself back in the eyes of the passenger. But I do actually think we need to start thinking about the railways as a national logistics strategy, a unified network, and actually the things that our passengers remember, the journey, and not necessarily the projects.
Thank you. We only have a few minutes left. Do you have any more questions from the floor, Dave?
Thank you. Henri, just a question to yourself, really. I really like the confidence that we will deliver phase 1, 2, 3. I'm a proud northerner, and picking up on Lisa's point, we've heard a lot of this before. My question is, it's not secured money, that 45 billion you say. It's still at the whims of government, the local politicians, the theme of the day. Mr. Burnham came out yesterday and said we're going to have now the northern leg of HS2 re-engaged. That's more money. We've got a defence crisis at the moment. We've got a cost of living crisis. How do we secure that? How do we secure it so that we do guarantee? How can we take it away from the politician's whim, I think is what I'm trying to say.
So, there's always risk, right? And we've got less than 2 minutes. And answer very, very briefly your point, which is that you didn't leave when agglomeration was mentioned. The other kind of it says you're a group of people who work in the rail industry. Economic people can be a lot more nerdier than you. And that's the concept of fiscal devolution, the idea that the reason why railways get built in Japan is that the local and regional government funds quite a big chunk of Shinkansen projects along with the private sector. In this country, there is one funder of HS2 and it's UK government. And that essentially means the Treasury fund it, right? And they quite happily play the game of trading off local and regional wider connectivity and all that thing to stop any project they can. We're not going to play that game anymore because when you have a mayor in Greater Manchester, probably won't be Andy anymore, but whoever comes after him, if he does win today, you will have someone who is paying for a big chunk of the underground station of Piccadilly. And so an incoming government can't just cancel that project. And this is exactly why Crossrail was very hard for the Treasury to cancel it. Because, by the way, Treasury wanted to cancel the Elizabeth line even when it had been started. My former boss, George Osborne, wouldn't let them. But one of the reasons they couldn't do it wasn't just because George told them to bugger off when they tried to get him to do it, was because Canary Wharf Group had already built half the station at Canary Wharf. And they sent the Treasury the number of what they'd have to pay them, not just for what they'd built, but the cost of that, and to put it back, and to then the loss that they would get against what they'd been promised in their funding agreement, the income they'd have made from that asset. And it's like, well, yeah, actually, that's quite a significant blocker to cancelling projects. If the North had been more willing to find mechanisms, and there is going to be new taxes and access to tax revenue. So Manchester, people will pay more income tax if we build an underground train station. We will build tower blocks on top of it, be full of offices, full of people living there. That will generate economic value. That is tax that otherwise wouldn't exist. And so you can borrow against that. Ooh. You can borrow against that money. Yeah, cool. If you borrow against that money, you can build stuff that you otherwise would never get done. And I am exactly where you are now. If it was just a blank cheque from the government that will have to be signed by every chancellor every year, because that's actually how public spending works, then, oh my God, it will never happen. Actually, I've got to the point of saying some of it should be built by the private sector through PPPs, through other models, because I bluntly would say to you that other people's governments that will happily invest in our infrastructure are probably more reliable counterparties than our own a lot of the time. And that's a sad indictment of our country, but there are other people in the world who can see the value that will be produced by these projects and will quite happily invest in it. They'll probably invest in an Olympic bid as well, by the way. So that is a very, very ambitious proposal that says, build the railway, hold the Olympics, demonstrates to the world that this country can do things again.
I think that is a perfect statement to end on, especially as we are 1 minute and 3 seconds over time, so thank you. But to sum all of that up, what I'm getting out of this is we do have bold plans. The supply chain is geared up and ready. We want to deliver. We do need that certainty. We do need those metrics up front to keep things flowing at that planning stage. But above all, we've all got to get behind the fact that the social and the economic impact of any major infrastructure scheme, it transcends cost-benefit analysis. It transcends business cases. Good transport across modes, across regions, across communities, changes lives. Would we all agree on that?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Could I ask you all to give a round of applause to our speakers?
Really lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Safe journey home, everybody.